The thick gray smog of the construction site didn't just drift, it hung like a heavy shroud over the skeletal steel frame of the new high-rise. In the center of the muddy lot, surrounded by concrete dust and discarded rebar, a pristine, mirror-polished leather boot came down with brutal force. It ground a small silver cross-shaped metal into the wet sludge, completely burying the engraved image of St. Florian beneath a layer of black grime. A few feet away, a lean Belgian Malinois named Smoke let out a low, vibrating rumble from the back of his throat. His lips curled back slightly, exposing sharp teeth, his muscles tensing beneath a massive, hairless patch of puckered scar tissue that ruined the fur on his left flank. A coughing old man sliding into his grave and a scarred dog have no right to teach a rich man how to spend his money. Arthur Miller sneered, adjusting his tailored wool coat, as he looked down at 50-year-old Thongwi Caleb. Caleb was doubled over, one hand gripping his chest as a violent, hacking cough rattled through his damaged lungs, his old turnout jacket covered in white cement dust. Miller spat into the mud near the crushed metal. "Get your pathetic animal off my property. This inspection is over." They looked at a veteran firefighter with a ruined chest and called him a useless, bureaucratic relic of the past. They looked at an injured arson K9 and saw nothing but a piece of damaged property fit for the shelter dumpster. But they did not know that the crushed silver metal was the sigil of an absolute vow, and the scarred dog's nose was the only line of survival that would remain when the gates of a digital hell opened at midnight. Fire Station 9 sat at the absolute edge of the city's industrial district, a place where the concrete was permanently stained with diesel grease and the air smelled faintly of sulfur and wet coal. It was an old red brick outpost built in an era before automated tracking and automated response systems. A station designed for a time when firefighting was a matter of muscle, grit, and raw instinct. Inside the drafty, echoing apparatus bay, the atmosphere was divided by a generational canyon. On the north side of the bay, 3 young firefighters in spotless, high-tech tactical uniforms stood around a stainless steel workbench. They were calibrating a fleet of heavy-duty autonomous fire drones and testing the hydraulic joints of a remote-controlled thermal suppression robot. Their conversation was a stream of digital diagnostics, sensor ranges, and microchip upgrades. To them, modern firefighting was a clean science, an equation solved from behind a monitor screen 20 yards away from the actual heat. On the south side of the bay, sitting on a rusted metal stool beneath a single flickering fluorescent bulb, was Caleb. At 50 years old, Caleb's eyes carried the permanent bloodshot weariness of a man who had stared into 1,000 furnaces. His hair was the color of fresh ash, and his hands were thick, heavily calloused tools covered in faint white burn scars. He was Lam Louis, silently, working on his old leather helmet, using a rag dipped in oil to polish the dented brass frontpiece. Every few minutes, a deep, raspy wheeze would catch in his throat, forcing him to stop and press a fist against his sternum until the spasm passed. 5 years ago, during a catastrophic subterranean warehouse collapse, Caleb had torn off his own oxygen mask to share his air with a trapped apprentice. He had survived the extraction, but the superheated toxic chemical smoke had permanently seared the lining of his lungs. The department hadn't fired him out of respect for his tenure, but he had been stripped of active command. He was relegated to routine fire code inspections, his voice reduced to a low, gravelly whisper that sounded like dry paper scraping across concrete. Beside his stool, leaning his heavy skull heavily against Caleb's knee, was Smoke. Smoke was a standard-issue Malinois, but like his handler, the fire had rewritten his silhouette. His entire left side was a broad, smooth expanse of shiny, pinkish-white scar tissue where no fur would ever grow back, the result of a sudden flashover in an industrial paint facility 2 years ago. where Smoke had thrown his body over a toddler to shield the child from a stream of leaking chemical acid. The blast had also left him with a stiff, hitching limp in his rear leg that grew worse whenever the damp autumn cold rolled into the city. The young tech firefighters on the other side of the bay didn't hide their disdain. They snickered when Caleb's chest rattled, and they called Smoke the burnout when the dog limped across the concrete. "Hey, Chief," the youngest technician called out, tapped the touchscreen of his drone controller with a smirk. "You really taking that old hound to the Grand Zenith project today? Miller's tech team just installed the new automated AI halon suppression grid. The building doesn't even need water anymore, let alone a dog that sniffs for lighter fluid." Caleb didn't look up from his helmet. He rubbed the soft skin behind Smoke's ears, his thumb tracking the edge of the dog's puckered scars. "The machines are fine until the power grid goes black, kid," Caleb replied, his gravelly voice low but carrying a heavy, undeniable weight that caused the young man's smile to falter. "An algorithm doesn't know the difference between the smell of burning copper and the scent of a human being suffocating behind a locked fire door. The nose doesn't need a battery." He stood up slowly, his spine popping as he reached for his heavy canvas turnout coat hanging from a wall peg. Attached to the left shoulder strap, right beside his tactical radio clip, was his most sacred possession, the small silver medal of St. Florian, the patron saint of those who battle the fire. It was Sutme, chipped at the edges, blackened by the soot of 100 blazes, but it was a constant reminder of the promise he had made 30 years ago when he joined the line. Smoke stood up instantly, his tail giving a single disciplined thump against the stool, his amber eyes instantly alert, shifting from passive companionship to rigid tactical readiness. He knew the coat meant a mission. He didn't need a leash. He slipped into his worn leather tracking harness himself, waiting for Caleb to buckle the brass clasps. "Come on, boy," Caleb whispered, his chest giving another short, painful hitch as he pulled open the heavy sliding bay doors, letting the cold, gray autumn rain wash over them. "Let's go see what Arthur Miller's billions have built." He had no idea that the glittering glass tower awaiting them at the center of the city was not an achievement of modern safety, but a massive, locked trap built on greed, and that within 12 hours, every digital system the city trusted would become completely blind. The Grand Zenith Tower rose like a jagged shard of tinted glass and polished chrome, piercing the heavy gray clouds of the city's skyline. It was the crowning achievement of Miller Industries, a 70-story monument to hyper-luxury commercial real estate. Every inch of the marble lobby screamed opulence, from the gold leaf trimmings to the high-end digital screens welcoming the city's elite for the grand opening gala scheduled for that very evening. But when Caleb and Smoke stepped through the revolving glass doors, the illusion of perfection immediately began to fracture. Smoke's nostrils flared the moment his paws hit the polished stone floor. The Malinois didn't look at the glittering chandeliers. His head dropped low, his nose scanning the baseboards and the seams of the utility walls. A sharp, rhythmic panting escaped his jaws, and his ears twitched back toward the service elevator shafts. He didn't whine, but his body went completely rigid, the exact behavioral cue Caleb had relied on for over a decade. Smoke smelled something that didn't belong in a finished luxury building. He smelled volatile chemical outgassing. Caleb adjusted the heavy canvas straps of his inspection bag, a sudden fit of dry coughing rattling his chest as he walked toward the main security desk. "Hold, boy," he whispered, his gravelly voice barely audible over the echoing acoustics of the atrium. 30 minutes later, deep inside the dark concrete belly of the building's primary electrical substation on the 4th floor, Caleb's worst fears were confirmed. Holding a high-powered flashlight in his single good hand, Caleb leaned close to the massive circuit arrays. He pulled back a section of the main conduit shielding. Instead of the heavily insulated, fire-resistant copper cables required by federal safety codes for a structure of this scale, the wires inside were thin, wrapped in a cheap, highly flammable synthetic polymer plastic. "They cut corners," Caleb muttered, his flashlight beam tracking the grid. Beside him, smoke was scratching aggressively at the base of the automated fire suppression tanks. Caleb knelt down, checking the digital pressure gauges on the automated halon gas delivery system, the very AI-driven matrix the tech firefighters had bragged about. The digital readout flickered wildly, showing a critical pressure drop in the emergency lines. The software was reporting a perfect status to the central monitor, but the physical valves were completely locked, jammed shut by cheap, uncalibrated hardware. The building's primary defense mechanism against a fire was a total lie. It was a digital illusion designed to pass an automated scan while leaving thousands of people inside a literal tinderbox. "This system is completely dead, Bo Smoke," Caleb whispered, his jaw tightening as he snapped a digital photo of the faulty valves. "If a transformer blows, this entire tower becomes a furnace in less than 10 minutes. I suggest you put that camera away, old man." The sharp, arrogant voice sliced through the damp darkness of the substation. Caleb turned to see Arthur Miller standing in the doorway. The billionaire developer was flanked by two burly private security guards and a younger man wearing a pristine white hard hat, the project's chief engineer. Miller didn't look at the faulty wiring. His eyes were fixed on Caleb's stained canvas turnout coat with an expression of intense disgust. "Thung ui, Caleb," Miller said, stepping into the room, his expensive leather dress shoes clicking loudly against the raw concrete. "My administrative team told me the department sent a relic to sign off on our final occupancy permit. I didn't believe them until I saw the soot on your face." Caleb stood up slowly, his lungs burning from the dusty air of the concrete vault. He held up his inspection clipboard, his voice steady despite the raspy wheeze behind it. "I'm not signing this permit, mister. Miller, your electrical main is drawing double its rated capacity using non-insulated residential-grade wiring. Your automated gas suppression valves are physically jammed. If you open this building tonight with 500 people inside, you are signing their death warrants." Miller didn't blink. A cold, dismissive smile spread across his manicured face. He reached into his tailored coat pocket, pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope, and casually tossed it onto Caleb's open clipboard. "There is $10,000 in cash in that envelope, Thungwi," Miller said smoothly, leaning his weight onto his titanium walking cane. "Consider it a retirement bonus from Miller Industries. Sign the document, take your crippled dog, and go enjoy whatever time your lungs have left. My tech team has already verified the digital grid. The computer says the building is safe. Your manual metrics are obsolete." Caleb looked down at the white envelope. The temptation of the money was hollow. $10,000 could buy a lot of medical supplements for Smoke's joints, but it couldn't buy back a single soul lost to a fire. With a deliberate, forceful motion, Caleb tilted the clipboard, letting the heavy envelope slide off the metal edge and crash directly into a puddle of dirty water on the floor. "My manual metric saved 3 lives in a warehouse collapse while your computers were still being assembled, Miller," Caleb whispered, stepping forward until he was inches from the billionaire's face. "The answer is no. I'm locking this sector down, and I'm calling a federal stop work order." Miller's smile vanished instantly, his features hardening into a mask of pure corporate malice. "You think that rusted badge gives you authority over a project of this scale? You're a Don Rock janitor in a yellow coat, Caleb." Miller pulled a state-of-the-art satellite phone from his pocket, hit a single speed dial button, and held it to his ear. "Chief, it's Miller. I have a rogue inspector named Caleb at the Grand Zenith site. He's disrupting our opening gala timeline over non-existent maintenance anomalies. Handle it. Now." Miller held the phone out toward Caleb. A loud, booming voice crackled through the speaker. It was the Thượng, fire chief of the city's central command, a man whose campaign budgets were entirely funded by Miller's real estate consortium. "Caleb! Stand down immediately," the chief roared over the line. "You are officially suspended from active duty pending a psychological evaluation for insubordination. Leave your badge and your inspection log with Mr. Miller's security detail. You are no longer authorized to represent this department. That is an absolute directive." The call went dead. Miller let out a short, mocking laugh as he pocketed the device. "You see, old man, progress doesn't have time for your integrity." Before Caleb could speak, Miller stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the left shoulder strap of Caleb's turnout jacket. With a sudden, vicious twist of his hand, Miller tore the silver St. Florian medal straight off the canvas fabric, breaking the heavy metal pins. He dropped the sacred artifact into the concrete dust, bringing the heavy heel of his Italian dress shoe down with full force, crushing the silver cross into the gravel. "Your tokens can't save you here," Miller muttered coldly. He turned to his guards. "Remove this trash from my building, and if that limping mutt growls at my staff again, call animal control to have it destroyed as a public hazard." The two massive security guards lunged forward, their heavy hands grabbing Caleb's shoulders. They violently shoved the 50-year-old veteran backward through the utility corridor, dragging him away from the substation. Smoke erupted into a fierce, protective crouch, his lips baring his teeth as he prepared to spring. But Caleb weakly reached down, pinning his hand against the dog's scarred flank. "Hold, Smoke. Hold, boy. Don't do it," Caleb choked out, his throat tightening as a massive wave of coughing racked his frame. "Stay down. That's an order." The guards threw open the heavy rear service doors of the tower, ruthlessly pushing Caleb and Smoke out into the freezing torrential autumn rain. Caleb collapsed onto his knees in the muddy alleyway, his hands scraping against the wet asphalt as the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind them, locking them out in the dark while the glittering lights of the Grand Zenith began to ignite for the wealthy crowd arriving at the front gates. The cold rain washed the fresh soot and grime from Caleb's face as he crawled toward the edge of the construction debris. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps, his damaged lungs screaming against the damp chill of the autumn night. He didn't care about the pain. His single, calloused hand dug furiously through the wet gravel and shattered concrete chips until his fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was the St. Florian medal. The silver cross was warped, its edges severely chipped and bent under the weight of Arthur Miller's expensive leather heel. The beautiful engraving of the patron saint was scratched, buried under a layer of dark grit. Caleb pulled the broken artifact to his chest, his shoulders trembling as he let out a low, defeated cough. Beside him, Smoke stepped into the downpour, his head low. The Malinois gently pressed his warm, wet muzzle against Caleb's neck, offering the only comfort left in a city that had discarded them. An hour later, the dark silhouette of Fire Station 9 offered a silent, cold sanctuary. The main apparatus bay was completely empty. The young tech firefighters had already deployed their shiny automated trucks and drone fleets to stand by near the Grand Zenith Tower for the opening gala. The glittering elite needed protection, and the department had sent its best assets to ensure the billionaire's party went off without a hitch. Left behind in the shadows was the old guard. Caleb sat on the edge of a rusted iron cot inside his makeshift quarters, a cramped, converted supply room at the back of the station that smelled permanently of industrial soap and damp canvas hoses. A single, low-wattage bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, tired shadows across the brick walls. His chest tightened violently, forcing him to reach for his rescue inhaler. He took a deep, shaky drag of the medication, his eyes closing as the chemical mist forced his scarred bronchial tubes to open. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. "We're a couple of ghosts, boy," Caleb whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp in the quiet room. Smoke lay flat on the concrete floor, his chin resting directly on Caleb's boots. The dim light highlighted the massive, hairless expanse of pinkish scar tissue on the dog's left side, a permanent reminder of the price they had paid for their loyalty. Smoke's single amber eye remained fixed on his master, tracking the slow, rhythmic movement of Caleb's hands. With a piece of clean flannel cloth and a small bottle of brass polish, Caleb carefully wiped the grime away from the broken St. Florian metal. He didn't have his badge anymore. His official authority had been stripped by a corrupt chief, and his integrity had been labeled as insubordination. But as the silver began to gleam beneath the dark tarnish, Caleb knew that true honor didn't come from a bureaucrat's permission sheet. He pulled a thick black leather cord from a drawer and threaded it through the bent loop of the metal. With a slow, deliberate movement, he leaned down and tied the sacred token securely around Smoke's leather tracking harness, right above the dog's scarred shoulder blades. "If they won't let me wear it, you will," Caleb muttered softly, his rough hand tracing the contour of the silver cross. "You're the truest firefighter this city has left." Smoke let out a soft huff, his tail giving a single heavy thump against the concrete. Outside, across the city grid, the glittering glass tower of the Grand Zenith was roaring with life, completely unaware of the digital rot eating away at its core. But inside the dark, forgotten storage room of Station 9, the old firefighter closed his eyes and began to recite the words that had guided his soul through 30 years of smoke and ash. "When I am called to duty, God, wherever flames may rage, give me the strength to save some life, whatever be its age. Help me embrace a little child before it is too late, or save an older person from the horror of that fate." It was a prayer whispered in the dark, a silent covenant between a broken man and a scarred dog. The tech firefighters had their algorithms, and Arthur Miller had his billions, but Caleb and Smoke had something the fire could never burn, an unbroken faith. And very soon that faith would be the only thing standing between 500 people and an absolute inferno. Midnight struck, and the Grand Zenith Tower was a beacon of synthetic starlight piercing the dark city skyline. Inside the glass atrium, the grand opening gala was a masterclass in opulence. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest elites clinked crystal champagne flutes under the dazzling glow of massive chandeliers. At the center of the room, Arthur Miller stood beside the corrupt fire chief, soaking in the praise of a fawning crowd. The digital screens around them displayed a perfect green status for the building's AI infrastructure. Everything looked flawless, but deep inside the concrete belly of the structure, the countdown to disaster reached 0. The massive electrical load from the gala's lighting, state-of-the-art climate control, and digital displays forced an immense surge of current through the primary substation. The cheap, uninsulated residential-grade wiring Caleb had flagged began to cook. Within minutes, the synthetic polymer insulation melted away, turning into a bubbling toxic liquid. A catastrophic electrical arc flash tore through the main transformer, detonating it in a blinding white explosion. The fire didn't just grow, it erupted like a caged predator breaking its chains. Instantly, the cheap plastic insulation ignited, generating a thick, heavy, oily black soot that was far more lethal than a normal timber fire. This toxic black smoke surged into the main air ventilation shafts, pumping poison to all 70 floors in a matter of seconds. The building's multi-million-dollar defense grid attempted to engage, but the physical valves of the automated halon gas system remained tightly jammed shut. The central computer kept sending commands to release the fire suppression gas, but the cheap hardware refused to move. The digital brain was completely paralyzed by its own mechanical failure. Outside, The night air was shattered by the scream of sirens. The city's elite tech firefighters arrived in a massive convoy of pristine modern trucks. They immediately deployed their expensive autonomous fire drones and remote-controlled thermal robots into the lower lobby. But the technology failed instantly. The smoke rising from the burning synthetic polymer was so dense, heavy, and saturated with particulate soot that the infrared and thermal sensors on the drones were completely blinded. The digital screens back in the command vehicle displayed nothing but solid, impenetrable black static. The high-tech robots, unable to navigate without digital coordinates, struck structural pillars and stalled out on the debris. The modern force was entirely helpless, locked outside a wall of toxic black fog. Up on the 70-story penthouse suite, the music had stopped. The glamorous atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by absolute panic as the lights flickered and died, plunging the tower into darkness. The toxic black smoke began to seep through the seams of the doors and executive vents, filling the luxurious room with a suffocating chemical stench. Arthur Miller ran to the executive elevators, frantically smashing his fist against the glowing buttons. Nothing happened. The primary power grid was dead, and the backup generators had failed to kick in due to the severed wiring. He sprinted to the emergency stairwell, throwing the heavy steel door open, only to be blasted backward by a wall of superheated black smoke. The stairwells had turned into massive chimney flues, funneling the lethal heat straight to the top of the tower. Miller collapsed to his knees on the plush carpet, a violent, hacking cough tearing through his chest as the toxic fumes began to strip the oxygen from his blood. Beside him, the corrupt fire chief was desperately screaming into his tactical radio, his voice cracking with pure terror as he begged the ground units for a rescue that wasn't coming. Their tech had failed them. Their wealth was useless. Wrapped in the dark, suffocating trap of his own creation, the billionaire realized that all his gold could not buy him a single breath of clean air. Outside the Grand Zenith Tower, the staging area was a theater of chaotic flashing red and blue lights, screaming sirens, and absolute high-tech helplessness. The command vehicle's exterior monitors hummed, but every single screen was a window of shifting black static. The young tech firefighters stood paralyzed around their control consoles, watching their expensive autonomous drones drop from the sky one by one, their optical sensors entirely melted and blinded by the unprecedented density of the synthetic polymer smoke. "The infrared can't pierce it," one technician shouted, violently slamming his headset onto the terminal. "The particulate soot is too thick. It's absorbing the thermal signatures. We have zero visibility inside, and the automated tracking map is completely offline." So the young battalion chief looked at the glass atrium, which had turned into a yawning mouth of pitch-black, swirling toxic fog. "No one goes in," he ordered, his voice trembling. "Standard operational protocol mandates we wait for the aerial chemical suppression units. Going into that void without a digital map is a suicide run." Then, out of the rain and the shadows at the edge of the police barricades, a ghost stepped forward. Caleb walked with a slow, heavy deliberation, his old canvas turnout jacket zipped to his throat, the collar turned up against the wind. His breath came in a steady, metallic wheeze, but his hands were perfectly steady as he adjusted the straps of his battered leather helmet. Beside his left boot, his body low to the wet asphalt, was smoke. The Malinois was hyper-focused, his single amber eye locked onto the burning structure, his ears pinned forward as the gold-plated St. Florian metal on his harness caught the frantic glare of the strobe lights. The young technician stared in disbelief as the suspended veteran bypassed the security line. "Thượng, Caleb! What are you doing?" the battalion chief yelled, lunging forward to grab Caleb's arm. "You're relieved of duty, and you can't go in there anyway. The sensor arrays are dead. There's no data stream. You'll turn into ash in 5 minutes. Caleb didn't stop. He didn't even turn his head. He simply reached down, pulled a modified, low-profile tactical oxygen mask from his gear bag, one he had custom-fitted with a tight double-layer charcoal filtration mesh, and strapped it securely over Smoke's muzzle. The dog didn't fight the restraint. He blew a sharp breath through the filter, accepting the gear with the calm discipline of an elite operator. "I don't need a data stream, kid," Caleb's gravelly voice cut through the blare of the sirens, carrying the cold authority of a man who had survived 100 hells before computers were invented. "The dog doesn't read screens. He tracks life." With a sharp, silent jerk of his head, Caleb gave the signal. "Search, Smoke. Bind the source." The old firefighter and the scarred K9 crossed the threshold, diving directly into the black void of the Grand Zenith. The moment they breached the inner glass doors, the world outside ceased to exist. The visibility dropped to absolute zero. It wasn't the gray, floating smoke of a wood fire. This was a heavy, oily, pitch-black chemical paste that hung in the air like a solid wall, sticking to Caleb's helmet visor and instantly coating his turnout gear in a layer of greasy soot. The heat was immediate, a physical blow that pressed against Caleb's chest, forcing an involuntary, agonizing cough beneath his respirator. His lungs burned, the old shrapnel and scar tissue inside his chest throbbing in protest. But Smoke was already moving. To a human, the darkness was total and terrifying. But Smoke was mapping the Inferno through an entirely different dimension. His ancestral canine instincts, amplified by years of specialized arson tracking, transformed the toxic maze into a sensory map. His nostrils flared rhythmically beneath the custom charcoal mask. To Smoke, the tower didn't smell like luxury or gold. It smelled like a battleground of distinct chemical signatures. He filtered out the overwhelming, deafening stench of the burning synthetic polymer wiring. He ignored the sharp, acrid bite of melting plastic and the heavy sulfur of exploding circuit boards. He was searching for a very specific, micromolecular scent profile: the heavy, iron-rich salt of human sweat, the frantic carbon dioxide of rapid, suffocating exhalations, and the unmistakable pheromones of human terror. Click, click, click. The sound of Smoke's claws scratching against the hot, soot-covered marble floor was Caleb's only guide. Caleb walked in absolute darkness, one hand extended forward, his fingers lightly brushing the wall while his entire focus remained on the tension of the heavy leather lead attached to Smoke's harness. He felt every micro movement of the dog through the leather cord. A sharp tug to the left meant a fallen structural beam. A sudden slack meant an open elevator shaft plunging into the dark. They moved past the burning shell of the secondary administrative offices on the 3rd floor. The cheap drywall was crumbling, collapsing into piles of white-hot powder that hissed as the building's ruptured water pipes sprayed uselessly in the dark. The heat was rising exponentially, the ambient temperature climbing past 200 degrees. Caleb's turnout coat began to bake, the outer layer of heavy canvas emitting a thin trail of white smoke as the heat threatened to breach the thermal barrier. "Keep moving, boy," Caleb wheezed through his mask, his legs shaking with a brutal leaden fatigue. "We're running out of time." Suddenly, the leather lead snapped taut with immense force. Smoke stopped dead in his tracks, his body dropping into a low, rigid point. He let out a sharp, muffled huff through his air filter, his muzzle pointing directly up toward the ceiling. Above them, through the structural gaps of the utility shafts, a terrifying low-frequency roar echoed. The fire had found the main ventilation trunk. It was transitioning from a localized electrical fire into a full-scale flashover on the upper executive levels. Smoke pivoted, bypassing the blocked main stairwell entirely. He led Caleb through a narrow, hidden service corridor behind the kitchen galleys, a path that wasn't marked on the young firefighter's digital blueprints, but one that Smoke's nose recognized as a channel of cooler, descending air. They began the agonizing ascent, climbing the steel service stairs, flight after flight in the crushing dark, the heat pressing down on them like a physical weight. On the 68th floor, the air was a toxic soup of superheated gases. Caleb's vision was swimming with white spots. His oxygen tank was clanging with the hollow ring of a low-pressure warning. His lungs were failing, his breath coming in short, agonizing gasps that tasted like copper and ash. He stumbled, his knee striking a jagged piece of fallen metal ceiling track, sending him crashing heavily to the floor. "Smoke!" Caleb groaned, his hand slipping from the leather lead. He couldn't get back up. The darkness was closing in, not just from the fire, but from the lack of oxygen in his brain. "Go! Get out, boy!" But Smoke didn't leave. The Malinois turned back, his paws digging into the soot-covered floor as he buried his head beneath Caleb's shoulder, using his massive, broad chest to physically heave his master's torso upward. The silver St. Florian medal on Smoke's harness pressed firmly against Caleb's palm, the sharp, cold edges of the metal cross acting as a shocking anchor to reality. Caleb looked into the dog's single amber eye through the smoke. There was no fear in that eye, only an ancient, unwavering command to survive. With a raw, guttural growl that tore what was left of his voice, Caleb forced himself back onto his feet. He leaned heavily on Smoke's strong back, using the dog as a living crutch as they pushed through the final double doors into the executive penthouse suite. The luxury room was a tomb. The beautiful floor-to-ceiling glass windows were cracked from the intense thermal pressure, looking out over a city that couldn't see the horror inside. Near the center of the room, lying face down on the ruined, expensive carpet, was Arthur Miller. His tailored cashmere coat was burned, his face covered in a thick layer of gray ash, his fingers clutching his chest as he lay completely unconscious, suffocating from the toxic polymer fumes. A few feet away, the corrupt fire chief lay slumped against a mahogany desk, entirely unresponsive. Caleb stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the billionaire. He checked Miller's neck. The pulse was faint, thready, and rapidly fading. "Smoke! We have to lift him," Caleb wheezed, his own oxygen alarm screaming its final continuous flatline tone. Caleb gathered the last remaining ounces of his physical strength. Using his old, combat-tested lift technique, he dragged Miller's heavy, limp body up onto his shoulders, but the added weight was too much for the veteran's damaged lungs. As he turned back toward the exit corridor, a massive structural beam above the doorway groaned under the thermal distortion and collapsed with a deafening crash, sealing the main exit path with a wall of burning timber and concrete block. The air was completely gone. Caleb fell to his knees again, the weight of Miller sliding off his back into the dirt. Caleb's vision went entirely black, his respirator mask slipping from his face as he collapsed flat onto his stomach, unable to move a single muscle. They were trapped. The fire was closing in from three sides, the flames licking at the edges of the plush carpet. But Smoke wasn't done. The scarred K9 didn't panic. Seeing his master down and the exit blocked, the dog's Tier 1 rescue training took complete control. He ignored the flames scorching his fur. He dropped low, his powerful jaws slamming shut around the thick, heavy leather turnout belt of Arthur Miller's trousers. With a violent, savage heave of his neck, Smoke began to pull. His crooked rear legs slipped on the greasy soot, but he dug his front claws deep into the carpet fibers, using every pound of his muscle to drag the 190-pound billionaire backward through a narrow, shifting gap beneath the collapsed concrete pillars. The silver St. Florian medal on his back gleamed brilliant red in the reflection of the surrounding flames as Smoke, single-handedly, dragged the man who had called him a monster out of the jaws of the furnace, leaving a clear trail through the ash for the rescue teams that were finally scrambling up the stairs. The first cold, pale light of dawn broke through the heavy soot-choked sky, casting a bleak gray hue over the smoldering ruins of the Grand Zenith Tower. The glittering glass facade was gone, replaced by a blackened skeletal mountain of melted steel and cracked concrete. On the tarmac below, the staging area was a graveyard of burned-out tech drones and stalled rescue robots. The young tech firefighters stood in exhausted silence, their pristine uniforms ruined, staring helplessly at the wreckage of the multi-million-dollar digital grid. Then, the heavy rear service doors of the lobby violently rattled. Out of the pitch-black wall of toxic smoke emerged a figure that caused the entire perimeter line to freeze. It was Smoke. The scarred Malinois was flat to the ground, his front claws digging into the wet asphalt as his powerful jaw remained locked onto the heavy turnout belt of Arthur Miller. Smoke's crooked rear leg hitched violently with every step, his chest heaving under the weight of the unconscious, soot-covered billionaire. But he did not let go. Right behind him, stumbling through the ash, was Caleb. His oxygen tank was completely empty, clanging a dead rhythm against his back. He had no mask left. His face was entirely black with polymer muoi, then soot, and a thin line of blood ran from his nose. But his single calloused hand was firmly anchored to Smoke's leather harness. He had walked his dog through the center of hell, and they had brought the monster out alive. Paramedics immediately rushed forward, tearing Miller's limp body away from Smoke's jaws to slam him onto a trauma gurney. The corrupt fire chief, who had managed to escape with minor smoke inhalation minutes earlier, stepped forward with a frantic, desperate anger. He looked at Caleb, then at the gathered reporters and cameras flashing at the edge of the barricades. "Caleb!" the chief barked, trying to mask his own cowardice with administrative authority. "You were officially suspended. You violated a direct order and breached a restricted hazardous zone without structural clearance. Your insubordination put this entire operation at risk. Hand over your gear immediately. You're done." Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. He fell to his knees in the wet clay, a violent, hacking cough racking his entire body as a paramedic pressed an emergency oxygen mask over his face. He simply reached out his hand, his trembling fingers resting on Smoke's head. Before the chief could call his security detail, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of twin-engine blades cut through the morning air. A massive, twin-rotor, executive transport helicopter bearing the official seal of the state government descended rapidly, its powerful downwash scattering the ash and debris across the boulevard. The aircraft hadn't even fully settled before the heavy cabin door slid open, and a man surrounded by 4 state troopers stepped directly into the gray mud. It was the governor. His face was a mask of absolute fury as his sharp eyes took in the devastation of the tower. He bypassed the local politicians, ignored the corrupt fire chief who had rushed forward with an outstretched hand, and walked with terrifying purpose straight toward the medical tents. The chief scurried behind him, pointing a trembling finger at Caleb. "Governor, I am already compiling the incident report. This suspended officer illegally entered the perimeter, disrupting our automated containment matrix." The governor stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't look at the chief. His gaze had dropped entirely to the wet leather harness on Smoke's back. There, scratched, warped, and blackened by the fire, was the silver St. Florian medal, its metallic cross catching the sharp glare of the morning sun. The governor slowly sank to one knee in the dirty water, completely indifferent to his tailored suit. His hands trembled as he reached out, his thumb gently tracing the chipped, bent edges of the silver cross. He looked up into Caleb's bloodshot, soot-covered eyes. 20 years ago, the governor's voice broke, vibrating with an intense, raw emotion that silenced the entire crowd. A young firefighter crawled into a burning tenement house on 4th Street when every machine said the structure was collapsing. He didn't have a digital map. He only had his hands. He brought my 5-year-old daughter out of the bedroom before the roof came down, and he wore this exact medal on his coat. The entire staging area fell into a suffocating, stunned silence. The young tech firefighters dropped their diagnostic monitors, their jaws open. The governor stood up, turning to face the state troopers, his voice hardening into absolute granite. Kamtaiten Kukjung la ngay tayo, handcuff the chief right now. Issue a state warrant for Arthur Miller for corporate manslaughter, gross safety fraud, and corruption. Seize every digital log from this company. I want them in a state penitentiary by midnight. The troopers moved like lightning. Within seconds, the corrupt chief's badge was ripped from his chest. His hands slammed behind his back as the steel handcuffs clicked shut. Miller, coughing on his oxygen gurney, was flanked by state police, his wealth completely useless against the weight of the state tribunal. The governor turned back to Caleb. He took off his own heavy woolen winter coat and draped it gently over the old firefighter's shivering shoulders. Then, the highest official in the state stood at absolute attention, raised his right hand to his brow, and delivered a flawless, rigid military salute to the 50-year-old veteran and his scarred dog. Click. In perfect unison, the entire line of young tech firefighters, the paramedics, and the police officers took off their helmets. A massive wall-to-wall salute erupted across the entire block, 20 arms snapping up in perfect discipline through the falling ash. Max sat tall beside Caleb, his single amber eye reflecting the flashing red lights, his head held high against the dying smoke. In a world that is completely obsessed with shiny new technology, expensive data grids, and polished corporate promises, it is dangerously easy to treat our true heroes like relics of the past. The greedy elite looked at an old firefighter with a ruined chest and a scarred, limping dog, and they saw an eyesore, a nuisance to be discarded for a multi-million-dollar real estate project. They called him a monster because of his scars, never realizing that those exact scars were the only reason they were given a second chance to breathe. True heroism cannot be calculated by an algorithm, and it can never be bought with a billionaire's envelope of cash. It lives in the soot on a man's face, the loyalty of an animal that refuses to abandon its post, and an unbroken faith that burns brighter than any fire. Never judge a protector by their sunrush, worn-out gear, or their slow, so-heavy steps, because when the digital systems fail and the darkness turns absolute, it won't be a machine that pulls you from the furnace. It will be an old soul who knows the true price of a promise. If the story of Caleb's faith and Smoke's sacrifice touched your heart today, leave a smoke in the comment section below to honor the heroes who run into the fire when the world runs out. Don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Threads so you never miss another journey into the heart of silent honor. Until next time, stay loyal to those who stood by you in the dark.